Hi, everybody. I'm Kaileigh. Thank you so much for coming. So I have been a privacy engineer at Confiant, which is a cybersecurity startup in the ad tech space for almost 3 years. So I know ad tech pretty well, and I have looked at an awful amount of tracking. I've also been a software engineer for about 6 years, so I know my way around a code base. I'm a huge cybersecurity nerd and also a recovering political science major. This talk just conveniently happens to combine all of my interests. So today we are going to be talking about Yandex. It's a Russian search giant, a massive platform that has over 90 different services under its umbrella. And in January of 2023, almost 45 gigabytes of Yandex source code was leaked on BreachForums, which has since been shut down. The last time I tried to visit, it looked like, the first slide of a 90s VHS with the FBI coming for you. So Yandex confirmed this leak, but they denied that it was a hack. Instead, they blamed it on a former employee. They have not made clear if they know exactly who that is, but I hope wherever they are safe. So I got involved when a fellow privacy researcher reached out to verify what he'd found in a different part of the code base. And after spending the week digging around and verifying his findings, one Friday night I sat down with a glass of wine and decided to dig into something that I was curious about. And what I found was creepy enough that I pinged my boss on the East Coast on a Friday night. And this talk is why I didn't get fired. So we are going to go into some more background on the Yandex leak because it's pretty juicy these days. We're going to dive into the code. We're going to talk about what they're collecting, what they're doing with it, and who they are sharing that data with, which is a whole can of worms. And then we're going to wrap up and hopefully have some time for Q&A. So let's dig into this background. So Yandex, Russia's largest search engine. It also has over 90 services under its umbrella, like Maps, a browser, they have a mail service, cloud platform, and smart devices. So the services that we're going to be focusing on for the purposes of this talk are, actually, sorry, I just glossed over an important slide. No, I didn't. So our app Metrika, which is Yandex's app and web analytics service. Crypta, which does behavioral analytics on user data to generate ad segments for targeting. And audiences, which allows you to pull in data from multiple sources to create user profiles or targeted ad segments. Those sources can be at Metrika, those sources can be third-party data brokers, and you can also pull in your own data. So Yandex's parent/holding company, for now, is Yandex NV. It's based in the Netherlands, so it is subject to a whole lot of pressure from the EU right now for reasons you can probably imagine. And the majority of Yandex's services and customers are obviously Russian, but a lot of its apps have international branches or customer bases. So, way back in 2019, Yandex granted what's called a golden share to this Kremlin-linked and frankly just Kremlin-controlled Public Interest Foundation, or the PIF, to, quote, defend the country's interests. Those interests probably being, according to Putin, preventing the private data of Russian citizens from falling into foreign hands and limiting foreign ownership of strategic tech firms. So this golden share meant that the PIF would have a veto over key company decisions and the power to temporarily remove Yandex's management, block a potential acquisition of the company, which we're going to see they've used, and nominate 2 permanent board members. So the Kremlin has long recognized the importance of Yandex holding vast amounts of user data, and they've always sought to control where it can be sent. So after Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, that script began to flip, and the EU began to express concern about Yandex collecting and storing the data of EU citizens in Russia, where it might obviously be vulnerable to Kremlin abuse. So Keir Gillies, who's a senior Russia fellow at the international think tank Chatham House, told The Guardian in this article, he urged the government to assess the potential threat from Russian tech companies in the UK, saying people are not aware of how much data they are spreading around when they use an app. The problem arises when it is a hostile state that wishes to cause us damage, and is interested in specific individuals they wish to track in this country. It has the potential to be weaponized against anybody. Do we want, at a time when Russia is considering the UK as an enemy, to be providing all our personal details to a server in Moscow? So, in March also, privacy researcher Zach Edwards, you are seeing completely different slides. I'm so sorry. Let me go in and fix this. I apologize sincerely. I accidentally made it click on the link. All right, well, that was cute. Thank you. So privacy researcher Zach Edwards sounded the alarm about Metrika's SDK sending analytics data back to Russia. So this Metrika SDK is embedded on hundreds of millions of apps that have been downloaded, including VPNs that were specifically targeting Ukrainian users. Yandex pushed back that they asked for consent and that data was anonymized, but experts and researchers at the time disagreed. And so did its own website, which seems pretty clear on what it can do with user data. So Yandex gave this very carefully worded statement. Yandex acknowledged its software collects device, network, and IP address information, but it called this data, quote, non-personalized and very limited. Sure. It added, although theoretically possible, in practice it is extremely hard to identify users based solely on such information collected. Yandex definitely cannot do this. A very carefully worded statement that lawyers obviously spent a great deal of time on. So, at the same time, Yandex is facing increased pressure from the Russian government through strict and increasingly tightening media laws to spread propaganda about the war in Ukraine, but also sanctions on its executives from the EU for spreading that disinformation, not just about Ukraine, but also about opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who said in a series of very spicy tweets that Yandex's claim of displaying, quote, news on its homepage was a, quote, solid, shameless lie. And Yandex, actually, according to the MIT Tech Review at this time, some 70% of the information on Yandex News at this time was coming from state-controlled media sources pushing propaganda. They created a tool without realizing how it could be appropriated and gamed by the Russian government, and they appropriated and gamed it. So Yandex, along with other Russian media companies, decided that it was smarter to restructure and sell off the assets that were getting it in trouble. So they started trying to sell the news and media apps. So by April, tens of thousands of engineers have fled the country. According to the MIT Tech Review, government figures show that 100,000 IT specialists left Russia in 2022, which is some 10% of the tech workforce. A number that is likely an underestimate, and many of these engineers worked for Yandex. So Yandex's executives have been facing sanctions from Europe, and in June, its CEO resigns. Its executive director has already resigned, leaving an open question of who is even running Yandex right now. It appears by default to be the board. So Yandex finally, in August, sells its news, Zen, and very surprisingly, the homepage, yandex.ru, which is very, very, very valuable internet real estate, to this Russian state-controlled social media company, VK. In exchange, what they got was sole ownership of VK's food delivery app. Now, if you go to Yandex.ru right now, it actually redirects to dzen.ru. So that delay in the sale was rumored to be the result of that golden share causing a holdup because VK was the obvious buyer from the start. And it's now not really clear what happened to the user data that those apps had access to. So Yandex's Dutch holding parent company by November has gotten very wary, and they've announced their plans to divest ownership and control of most of Yandex Group, and said in a statement that it was reviewing options to restructure the group's ownership and governance in light of the current geopolitical environment. And shortly thereafter, Kudrin, who is an economist and former finance minister and very close Kremlin ally, agreed to become Yandex's advisor on corporate development to advise on this restructuring. which now further tightens the Kremlin's control on Yandex. Now in January 2023, we're back to the leak. Software engineer Arseny Shestakov confirmed from current and past Yandex employees that the leak was real and that it reflects code likely dating to the start of the war on Ukraine in 2022. But that would mean that someone effectively archived this data on the day Russia invaded Ukraine and then held onto it for 11 months. But remember that the BreachForums post said that it dated back to July of 2022. And I found some Jupyter notebooks in the analysis section of Crypta that showed test outputs with data that dates to July of 2022, and it's pretty rare to future date test data. So that would suggest that this code is a little newer than was originally suggested. So Yandex, as we know, they confirmed the leak. There's really no doubt about that at this point, but they dismissed that it was a threat to its users or performance. And now we have an opportunity to test those strong claims they made about Metrika's data collection. So at the time of writing, Yandex is still up for sale. A lot of oligarchs expressed interest and they placed bids. And in June 2023, Putin finally approved one from some consortium of billionaires, read oligarchs, and VTB Bank, but the deal appears to have been rejected by Yandex's foreign owners because they have to find some oligarch that still exists that hasn't faced sanctions to sell it to, first of all. And there's a new Russian law that says that foreign investors have to sell Russian assets at least a 50% discount, plus a 10% tax on top of that. So good luck finding a deal that can make everybody happy with those circumstances. And as of now, there are rumors that if a sale can't be negotiated, it's very much on the table. So tensions are still continuing, despite Kudrin being there. Yandex was actually fined 2 million rubles in Russian court for refusing to share user data with security services. A stand that's probably going to be moot once nationalization happens or some Kremlin-approved deal actually goes through. And then very recent news. Medusa just reported that a new order signed by Russia's prime minister as of September 1st, 2023, Yandex will be required to provide the FSB with constant 24/7 access to data related to its taxi services, many of which operate internationally. Interestingly, the reporting also revealed that Yandex stores all of its global customer data in Russia and is not able to separate the Russian data from the international data, meaning it's all going to go to the FSB. And according to Yandex's own disclosures, it satisfied about 84% of official requests to share user data with the government. All right, I did it again. I am so sorry, guys. I did not know that was possible. The last time I put links on my slides and try to cite my sources properly. Sorry, y'all. We're back. So let's dive into the code. So the code written in the Yandex leak, it's broken down by service and application. It's written in a mix of Russian and English. And reporters have also noted uses of racist language in the comments. A variety of coding languages are used, but primarily Python and C++, also something called YQL, Yandex Query Language. It's a flavor of SQL. And this is just the code itself. It's not a Git repository, so I can't see the version history. It doesn't have the databases. We don't have the active machine models. So what we have is code, and we can't say for sure what portions of the code were actually run or are still active. Disclaimer. So I sorted through the Metrika and Crypta source code manually, but there are several portions that I haven't even had a chance to look at. So let's get started with Metrika. So that server-side app Metrika data is stored in a service called Metrika with a K, which encompasses the data from both the mobile SDK and the desktop analytics portion of the service. And these are some of the raw data fields that app Metrika logs. Remember that Yandex told the Financial Times that the data it collects is non-personalized and very limited? Sure. You can see at the top that this is even going into something called an anonymizer, but nothing about this level of data is anonymized when it gets to this point in app Metrika's servers. And you're going to see from how it's used that the data that Yandex actually uses and processes on the back end never really gets anonymized. So to start with, these unique identifiers are getting hashed, and that's nice. Theoretically, it's anonymizing, but they're still going to be very unique. In fact, more so because that hashing algorithm is going to add a ton of entropy. So that means that they're going to be easy to match probabilistically with other data about this device as it comes in, because all you have to do is hash any incoming identifiers and see if the outputs match. And that is how anonymization is supposed to work. It's supposed to keep it private and functional. So far, so good. But whatever this anonymization is supposed to accomplish, they mess it up, you'll see. So Metrika is also taking in some really precise location data. It's not that uncommon for app analytics to take in latitude and longitude so you can see where it's being used for dubious reasons. But what's not very normal is taking in a user's altitude, direction, and speed, which together with a timestamp give you a disturbingly accurate picture of a user's movements. And unless the app you're using is Pokemon Go or a run tracker, there aren't a lot of use cases that justify that level of data. Remember, Metrika's target audience is supposed to be product and growth teams. With this information, if someone was using your app in an airplane, you could see how high it's flying, how fast, and in what direction, which seems like overkill for a product and growth team. So let's take a look at how ineffective that anonymization gets with these fields. So a Wi-Fi SSID, if you don't know, and if you're here, you probably do, is essentially the name of a Wi-Fi network. So if you're connected to the Black Hat USA network right now, that is your SSID. Now here in Crypta, we have this data from Metrika. We have the device and original device ID, not clear what that is. Whether they're hashed or not at this point is unclear, and they render it irrelevant, you'll see. Here are those exact fields again, and thanks to the hashed or unhashed device ID, they're attached to a unique identifier. And here, both that device ID and SSID are being matched to a Yandex ID, which is important because that Yandex ID is matched to a lot of other pools of data within Crypta and Yandex as a whole. So one possible motive to select both is that an SSID might have multiple devices associated with it, which could stand in for a household or a group of coworkers. It could be a user who has multiple devices. It indicates a relationship. So here we have identifiers that are coming in through a click event, and they're being matched with any IDs, hashed two ways or unhashed, until a match is found in the system. So that event can be associated with the correct consumer or household and pre-existing data about them. So for example, it compares the plain Android ID, the MD5 hash of it, and the SHA1 hash of it. Not very secure hashes, by the way. So the fingerprint is generated using some of those raw fields we looked at, like client IP and OS version. That's a pretty typical fingerprint. You take device information, pull it into a dictionary, hash that, and it gives a pretty unique identifier that you can probably regenerate very similarly if you come across that device again, meaning you don't really need cookies. So having both, having both hashed and unhashed data types floating around the same tools, which is what this would indicate they're doing, pretty much undermines the anonymization. So as new information comes in, users' sociodemographic attributes are updated as necessary. And the basic attributes included here are age band, although they do have exact age in other parts of the system. But it's a nice attempt at generalizing for privacy purposes, a tiny gesture anyway. And they have sex, they're only doing male or female here, all associated with device ID, which has to get hashed before it is sent over the buffer. You can see at the bottom there, which suggests that it was processed and stored unhashed, which is pretty inconsistent and renders any anonymization that was going before pretty irrelevant because that's a massive hole they're leaving. Metrika also contains code relating to that Yandex Audiences product, which allows users to generate segments from multiple sources. And if you use data from Metrika or data brokers, you can generate segments including users who never touched your product before. So you can use Audience to generate data about pretty much anybody that Metrika or data brokers have running around in their systems. So Crypta, the main event. So Crypta is Yandex's behavioral analytics service. It analyzes all of this data, it determines attributes to create these really specific segments for ad targeting, specifically for Yandex ads. And it takes data points from all over Yandex's services, and it does that because Yandex advertises all over its services. So here are some examples of the segments that Crypta generates. Some of them are weird, some of them are very specific, some of them less so. So let's zoom in here. Smokers, that seems to track users who purchase specific smoking products. We're talking e-cigarettes, tobacco, nothing exciting. Summer residents, which uses geolocation data to track which users have dashas or Russian summer homes and how often they visit them. Travelers uses geolocation data to track when you've gone from your main region, which they have already determined, to another, and whether that travel was domestic or international. Mail data appears to pull from email data, which, remember, Yandex has an email service, to track whether you have any boarding passes, plane tickets, or hotel confirmations. The gas station segment, it appears to process where you actually showed up and bought gas. I don't even know if gas stations have websites, but we're talking actual visits. So it seems plausible that if Yandex can make these segments, anyone who has access to the same data could create a segment like young men of military age planning to leave Russia, or generate segments around vices and blackmail, and as we know, one way or the other, the Kremlin is about to get access to this data, and they can do just that. These are the bones of machine learning model training, and they seem to leverage some first-party data because they know whether you did business at the legal office or showed up to your medical clinic appointment or bought something at the pharmacy. And this is a very basic example of household information stored in Crypta. You have household ID, size, gender, any elderly, unfortunately they said has old, awkward, any children, but of course they have much more precise information than that, as we've already seen. Once again, we have at Metrika data associated with device ID being used to pull Wi-Fi information. They love it, they can't quit it. This time it's tracking connection types. It appears they have not heard of 5G, so this is probably a pretty old segment. And at Metrika SSIDs are once again being used for processing here. It looks like they're using it to deduplicate user records by saying, oh, this device is associated with a common Wi-Fi access point, probably a relationship here. These are some examples of the data pools that Crypta uses for processing for the purposes of its fuzzy matching in the graphs portion of Crypta. You can see lots of email information, geolocation of home and work, household, we just saw that, Recans appears to be search data, and there's that Wi-Fi again. So Crypta pulls email and login data, and they associate it with that Yandex ID. So if you connect any so-called anonymized data from at Metrika to a Yandex ID, Crypta can associate it with email and login information, which pretty effectively re-identifies it, and that is very convenient for law enforcement. And here we have Crypta just shamelessly scraping for every type of identifier it can think of. Yandex uses a passport system to create one Yandex login to rule them all, and it logs you in across all of its apps and services. This form, it takes in first name, last name, and phone number, and Crypta has some of this data. It can definitely take the passport user ID and associate it with a phone number. And as you can see from that source type passport profile, that suggests they probably have access to that first and last name too, but I did not actually see them using it, to be fair. And that name, passport, phone dump sure suggests that they are pulling these phone numbers at a pretty large scale. Here's some test mock-up data, as you can see. We have the passport ID, the login, some interesting names. They're not sure what was going on, and some phone numbers. One of the things that happens in graphs is that they process the latitude and longitude of your predicted home. Again, they've already done some processing there, associated with your Yandex ID, and all of the identifying data we now know is associated with that, and they plot it on a geograph, which they then use to find and plot your literal, not just K-neighbors, your literal neighbors, and all of their Yandex user IDs, and all of the identifying data associated with that. So here we have data from 2 Yandex products being used in Crypta in a super creepy way. No method needs to be called extract children from taxi. That just, oof, oof. This is part of a very long process that involves pulling children and ages from search data based on visits to certain search sites, and then from at Metrika, then from the taxi app, and then they pull it all together to create a very holistic picture of how many children are in a given household. And if you zoom in on that last section, you can see that once you have one kind of ID, you transitively have them all, whether it's household, passport, Crypta ID, Yandex ID, they're all associated in some form or another. which, given the email address, phone number data, so household data, and geodata, means pretty much all of the data in here can be very effectively re-identified. So Crypta also integrates, its profiles integrate biometric data that is most likely from smart speakers that use Yandex's Alice smart assistant, who is apparently very good with children. Crypta uses voice biometric data to identify children and their age range by voice to further build out the household's profile for use in ads. And that voice biometric data is presumably from this Alice product. Now, it's not unreasonable for a voice-activated product that is supposed to be able to interact appropriately with children to store their voices and be able to identify them. But this isn't in the Alice app. This data has been taken out of that app and its original function and purpose, and it is now in Crypta where it is being used for behavioral analytics. And you can also see in that socio-demographic segment they have birth date. And Crypta has a UI portal to display its household and user profile information. This shows marital status, income, children, 3 interests, and in case you're wondering what those interests are, pretty harmless. This is the list of available icons. Remember, this is a UI. Food, gifts, rests, all very interesting. And you can search these individual profiles by Crypta or Yandex user ID, which suggests that they're not just aggregating segments and serving them up. You can search for more information on individual consumers. And this is a list of the available app icons that can be associated and pulled into this profile, in case you still had any doubt that Yandex is pulling data from all of its apps into these profiles. And Yandex appears to be able to associate all of these IDs on the left to social media accounts on the right, including Instagram, Facebook, and VK, which, remember, is a Russian social media site. Let's get into Matcher. So Matcher is a section of Crypta's code that syncs fingerprinting events with 5 major Russian telecoms providers, actually 4 major Russian telecoms providers and Intent AI, which is something kind of adjacent to it. And this is outside of Yandex's own assets. So one of these providers, Rostelecom, is a Russian state-owned and run company. And it provides broadband service to Crimea and several parts of Ukraine. So this means that fingerprinting events that are synced with this provider through Crypta could be accessible, carefully wording that, to parts of the Russian state. So this is the Matcher. Again, it itself is not that exciting. The exciting thing is that it exists, right? But what's in it, pretty standard, at least for user syncing. So they're building a connection to the API. They're passing in a fingerprinting event, which has some basic data with it. Then Rostelecom, it takes that on its end, it matches it searches for a matching user, and it returns the external ID that it has for that user, which then gets associated and pulled into this, which is some test mockup data that they have for this process. So you can see what comes out is something that's sort of half log item, half fingerprint. And it has that new external ID, and it has that source. All right, so now we're gonna wrap up. So this is what they have, just some of it, and what they can use that to determine. And they have a UI to display this information and make it searchable by individual ID, and they are probably about to be state controlled. So these Metrika SDKs, they give Yandex a very broad international reach of data subjects, and Yandex has been, to put it mildly, evasive and misleading about how it uses that data and what it collects. And while the data points collected up front are fairly disturbing, that data can say so much more about you when it's matched and analyzed, along with other pre-existing data that a company already has access to, which a big company like this certainly obviously does. And this Matcher process is clear evidence that at least some of the data collected by Yandex could be synced with Russian state-owned entities already. So Yandex makes a few gestures towards anonymization, but they are pretty ineffective because hashing isn't used consistently, And more importantly, they collect data that could easily re-identify a user, and they make sure it is all firmly associated. They call it gluing through this chain of IDs. And if your company runs an app, pay attention to who's running your SDKs and what data points they're collecting and where they are sending your users data. Most of Yandex's data is stored in servers in Russia, and that article that Medusa just published shows that they aren't really able to separate the international from Russian data. Yandex, when it got hit with the charges about the Metrika SDK last year, basically said that it got consent through the apps and that it only gets the data that app developers decide to send it, laying the blame pretty firmly at its partners' doorsteps. And if you're a consumer, know that nothing stays harmless forever. Maybe you trust this app with your data now, but what happens when that app gets sold to a company you don't know or trust? Or that company is headquartered in a country that becomes hostile to yours, or that government starts making very concerning demands to turn over user data. Yandex got itself into a situation where that Russian state gamed those news algorithms and effectively made it all 70% state-sponsored propaganda because they built a tool without considering the risk of how it could be abused by the Russian government. And that is also how we should think about Yandex's ad tech ecosystem. Yandex built a massive system of data collection and analysis that commingles Russian and international user data, and it is very likely about to be handed to the Kremlin on a silver platter. The Russian government could do a lot of harm with it, and in 2019, again, that recent Medusa article was very interesting. Apparently, they turned over taxi data that helped the authorities fabricate a criminal case against a Medusa journalist, and it also revealed a confidential office location. So is improving ad targeting and personalized user experiences, which is the justification used not just by Yandex when they responded to Wired's questions about my research, but also by the ad tech industry in general whenever anyone asks them about data collection. So is improving ad targeting and personalized user experience really worth the risk of building tools that can be exploited in this way? All right, thank you guys so much for coming. I believe we have some time for Q&A here, but I will also try to stick around for the wrap room if anyone still wants to talk. We have the link to the write-up and the link to the slides, and then Wired published some research this morning also on my research.